Welcome back to the podcast history of our world. Chapter 57, the Xia Dynasty. During the age of the good Emperor Yao, rampant flooding was doing a real number on his realm. He sought advice from his wise council, and they all agreed that a lord of the Xia tribe named Gun would be the most able to control the waters. Gun, wishing nothing more than to serve as emperor, of course, worked diligently at the task, but after 9 years on the imperial dole, nothing had been achieved. The only thing to occur during this time was that Yao had died, and Shun was now emperor. He, being a pragmatic sort of fellow, was pretty livid at Gun's continued failures, so he banished him to die in solitude atop a mountain. Pretty rough business, but then Shun decided to appoint Gun's son, Yu, to pick up where his father left off. Why choose the son of the man you just ordered executed? Wouldn't Shun be afraid of a revenge stabbing? Or at least a revenge poison your tea? Well, here's the scoop. In the rankings of Chinese nobility, Yu corresponds to an earl, and most importantly, his family were descendants of the Great Yellow Emperor Huangdi. Obviously something to be proud of in the family tree, and while Yu was no doubt sad about his father, he was more disappointed in him. No less than the Emperor of China, the chosen of heaven, selected his family to restore harmony to the land, and Dad screws it up? Unacceptable. So yes, while somebody like Hamlet might start sharpening swords and digging up jesters, Yu was cut from a different cloth. He bore Emperor Shun no ill will whatsoever, and resolved to correct this blight on the family name. Yu took even longer than his father. 13 years, actually, to stop the flooding, and as to why Shun didn't execute him in the 9th year, no text says why, but it's probably because he showed actual improvements. His strategy worked, and it makes sense. Order construction of dams, dikes, rechanneled rivers, man-made lakes, doling out farmland to soak up extra water. And just listing things off makes it sound easy, but Yu was no simple bureaucrat. He got right down into the mud with his workers and aided in the work projects. It's said that his hands and feet became covered with thick calluses because of his work, not a typical sign of a noble of his status. But Yu was completely engrossed in his task, almost obsessed with controlling the floods. How much of a workaholic was he? Well, he was such a workaholic that at some point during these years he got married, spent 4 days with his new wife, and went straight back to work. According to folklore, Yu passed by his house 3 more times during those 13 years, each time never going in. The first time he even met his son, the kid was about 10 years old. Oh, and once the flooding had been controlled, Yu was called on for a different sort of task. Political redistricting. Sort of. He divided the realm into 9 provinces, cutting down trees to reflect boundaries and inspecting the land for everything from soil quality to what tributes the people should give, and even instructing villagers on rudimentary irrigation techniques. And from these provinces, Yu created small subdivisions, with the imperial capital in the center, and the various domains encircling it. The land for the highest nobles, aka the friends and family of the emperor, was conveniently closest to the capital, and it came complete with the peasants who worked it. And if that sounds familiar, that's because it's feudalism, a system which will appear many times in history. And on this map, further out from the nobles were soldiers, scholars, the poor, while towards the fringes were criminals receiving various punishments. The worst offenders were banished to the farthest reaches of the fledgling empire, which might not sound like a big deal, but these people are also the first ones to be attacked by any wandering horde of barbarians, so there's that. Yu had accomplished much, and Shun knew he had found his inevitable replacement. But Yu was not keen on the idea of being emperor. He bowed before Shun, face touching the floor, and spoke. When I married, I stayed at home for 4 days. When my son Qi was born, I did not take care of him. For these reasons, I was able to accomplish the work of waters and lands and assist you. And Shun replied, It was your work which made it possible to guide my deeds. And then the ghosts of their ancestors appeared, and a phoenix popped in, and there was great singing and dancing as the emperor composed a song on the spot, and, long story short, after 17 years on the throne, Shun died, and Yu was now to become emperor. But seriously, he didn't want the job, and as soon as he had been made emperor, he nominates his chief advisor, Gao Yao, to the throne. But before he could make the transfer, Gao Yao dies. Yu spends the next 10 years operating out of his capital at Erlitao in central China. He spends much of that time touring the provinces before deciding that a fellow worker of his from the flood days, Yi, would make a great emperor. And Yu, now an old and tired man, dies. We'll say around the 2000s BC. Finally, he was freed of the burden of being an emperor. Except Yu's greatness did not die with him. The people he had helped, the lords whose lands he enriched, everyone wanted him back. And since that couldn't happen, they wanted the next best thing, his son, Qi. The poor guy had spent the early years of his life neglected by his father's workaholism, but still he grew up well-educated and well-liked. Yi must have realized the futility in holding the throne, and gives it up without a fight to Qi. A quick interjection here. The title of emperor quickly gives way to king for a while now. It won't be used again until later with the Qin. Anyway, Qi is all set to become king, but first has to stomp out rebellious warlords and tribal villages not happy with their new leader. But it's what he does at the end of his life that sets China down a path away from the sage rulers of old. Qi gives the throne to his son. I know that doesn't sound like much, but by that action, Qi has now solidified the Xia, his tribe, as China's first dynastic house. Gone are the days of meritocracy, where the emperor would choose the most qualified person. Now, leadership passes from father to son. And how long do you think it would take before a rotten leader took the throne? 3 generations? 4? Well, Qi's son, named Taikang, is that kind of leader. Lazy, uninterested in state business, and obsessed with hunting, disappearing for weeks at a time. His brothers even composed a lamentation for their family name as a result of Taikang's actions, stating, "If one man err repeatedly, should dissatisfaction be waited for until it appears? In my dealing with the millions of the people, I should feel as much anxiety as if I were driving 6 horses with rotten reins. The ruler of men, how should he be but reverent of his duties?" Taikang dies, eventually, and the throne passes to his son, Zhongkang, who's notable for having a solar eclipse happen during his reign. 2 things about that. 1, people are incredibly superstitious back then, and 2, the Chinese already have astronomers who can accurately predict these events. Except his. They were too busy drinking and fooling around and completely botched it, causing the populace to go into total freak-out mode when the sun disappears. Solution? He orders a marquis of his to bring death to the 2 astronomers. Of course, if the dynasty was on better terms with the people, he might have smoothed things over more, but never mind that. In fact, the Shah can't seem to read the will of the people, and the 5th Shah ruler is assassinated, the first we see a Chinese ruler fall in such a way. His son, Shao Kang, later avenges his father and restores the faith of the people in their family. As for the rest of the Shah leaders, it's a murky list of ups and downs, years on the throne, who begat who, and so on. All the hard work Shao Kang had put into restoring the Shah name starts to fall apart around the 14th leader, Kong Jia, who made a name for himself hunting ghosts and drinking a lot. And then the whole thing comes to a screeching halt with King Jie. He's your typical deranged megalomaniac. You know, the kind that laughs at inappropriate things and lacks any basic shred of humanity. Where to begin with him? Well, upon taking the throne, he immediately orders a new bigger palace constructed. Not necessarily out of the playbook here, but he drained the treasury to do so. And then when he needed more money, he increased taxes. Next, there's the standard executing of dissenters, or those he just assumed were dissenters. There's his rampant alcoholism brought on from his love of grain alcohol, which when consumed always made him want to ride someone like a horse. And if you couldn't keep up, that's right, you were executed. But perhaps the most grandiose and implausible story to come out of Xie's reign concerns a mistress of his, who convinced him to build a giant lake filled with wine. This lake contained a barge where Xie would hold court, but also depraved acts unfitting of a king. Also, after the lake was completed, the mistress persuaded Xie to order 3,000 men to drain it by drinking it dry. These men barely made a dent in the lake before collapsing and drowning. Now all these actions hadn't escaped the watch of his ministers, who pleaded with him to change his ways. But Xie was obstinate. "Everything under heaven is mine. I am like the sun in the sky, and how could the sun be destroyed?" Well, one person who took that as a challenge was a duke named Tang, a nobleman of the Shang kingdom to the east. The Shang maintained autonomy in exchange for tribute to the Shah, but enough was enough. Duke Tang deftly played the role of humble servant to Xie, biding his time while he convinced 40 other lords to join his cause and build an army. The texts say that at some point Tang was thrown in jail, but then he was released, with no explanation why. Tang hightailed it back home, to where he summoned his allies and by all accounts behaved as a king should, with virtue. He even used his troops to conquer a neighboring tyrant, and once the time was right to march on the Shah, he gave a rousing speech. "You say the Shah have committed offenses, but what can we do about it? Even though the king of Shah has used your strength and taken your wealth, the masses still say we will die together with you, Xie. Well, now I must go to chastise him. And you'd better follow me, this single man, to carry out heaven's punishment. I will reward you grandly, but do not doubt me. If you do not obey this vow, I will enslave you and your family. There will be no reason for pardon." It's not a bad speech, but Tang wasn't pretending to be a softie. He even calls himself the militant king to drive the point home. And he'd need to be tough to take on a despot like Xie. The two armies eventually clash, but the Shah forces were demoralized, poorly trained, and just not on their game. When the dust cleared, the Shang were triumphant. Xie was sent into exile to die a broken man. When asked on his deathbed what regrets he had, Xie responded, "I regret failing to kill Tang, and that is what has brought me to this." What a class act. As for Tang, he allowed many Shah nobles to keep their land in exchange for their loyalty and taxes, which they gladly gave. The Xia Dynasty had given way to the Shang, and while Tang strove to be a model ruler, who knows what the future would bring for his descendants. As for us, in the next episode, we continue to move through the mists of ancient Chinese history to the first recorded historical dynasty. See, while there's some evidence for the Xia, they're still considered legendary. And as for the Shang, I just have 2 words for you: turtle bones, which will make more sense next time on the podcast History of Our World.